In today's lesson, I want to cover the topic of how to capture atmosphere in your paintings. When trying to capture atmosphere, wet on wet technique and dry brush strokes are absolutely critical, along with getting good tonal variation in your painting. So here, when we look at this subject, we've got some of these lovely yellows and bright greens there, and some cooler blue grey greens in the distance. And that's very important to get that contrast between the bright greens and the cooler greens, because that will also add depth through our painting. As objects move further into the distance, the effect of the atmosphere causes them to lean more towards the blue, and also their colours get duller. And the detail becomes less, so the shapes become softer. So we're going to add all of that to help create as much atmosphere in our painting as we can. Obviously there's lots of green in this, so that's going to be our major colour. So let's mix 3 big puddles. This is not a very big painting, so I don't have to go overboard with my mixing. So here I'm going to use some Aureolin. Winsor Lemon would also do if you don't have Aureolin, and any cool green leaning yellow would be very good. And then some Cobalt Turquoise. And we'll just test it. So what I'm doing with the testing is I first aim to achieve the right colour, and then I adjust that to get the right tone. That's good for that. And here we'll start with the same colour, some yellow, Cobalt Turquoise. You can't use the cad yellow for this because it will immediately dull this colour. Cad yellow has a little bit of red in it, and the red is the complement of the green, and that will dull it. I'm going to add some raw umber, and that will dull the green. So I don't want all the green to be very bright. This is an Australian scene, and a lot of our foliage in our trees is more of a dull grey colour. Added some raw umber and a little bit of French ultramarine. The French ultramarine as well will dull the colour a small amount because it has a little bit of red in it. Already you can see how much duller that is than that. I think that's good. Then we need a blue grey colour for the distance, so this is quite a bluish green. And really all that I did there is picked up a brush load of that and added water to it, which I'd already put in my palette, and a little bit more French ultramarine. There you go. So this is more of a bluish grey, this is a warmer grey, and this is quite a bright green. Then here I'm going to mix a darkish grey colour that I'll use for some of the branches and that. And for that, just some burnt sienna and some French ultramarine. And I'll start with some lighter tones and then I'll darken that as I go in the painting. Just wet it once more. And then I'll wet the board. This just helps keep the painting very flat, and the water in the back of the painting slows down the drying time, giving me a lot more time to paint, especially in these wet on wet sections. Now, some people prefer to wet the front of the paper when they're doing these sort of soft edges. Problem with that is, if you wet the front of the paper and then start painting, all these colours that you've spent time getting correct tonally will be wrong, because the water that's on the surface of your paper will dilute these mixtures. So you have to give that some thought. The other thing too is, if you wet the whole front of your paper, you won't get any sharp edges because everything will be wet on wet, and we want a little bit of both. So let's pick up some of this cool blue, and I'm going to add a little bit of Cobalt Blue just at the top, because it's marginally lighter up there and a little bit bluer. And I want to give some thought to where the brighter greens are going to go. In fact, I'll lift some of that. If it's easier for you, by all means, just very lightly outline where you want to put some of this foliage. Just don't press very hard. Got some lovely bright green here. On one or two of these rocks. So right now I'm concentrating on getting the brighter colours and the lighter colours onto my painting. I keep adding some water in my brush because my mixture is a bit too strong. Now some of this bluey green colour I used up there, I can add some burnt sienna to that, maybe a bit more cobalt blue. And we'll use that for the water. A bit too strong, Joe. That's better. Just some quick brush strokes here and there to leave behind some white paper. If you have trouble creating dry brush strokes, just take some of the paint out of your brush so you're not painting with a fully loaded brush. Clean some of that out. Pick up some of this green because I've got plenty of it. And I want to create a stronger tone. I'm going to do that by adding more raw umber and French ultramarine to it, because some of these areas are quite a bit darker. A bit lighter here. I'm not trying to copy everything that's in this photo. Really, I'm just using the photos as inspiration. And I'll begin adding some texture up here. Just small little splatters. Not a lot of paint in my brush, not tapping my brush too hard. If you're not used to using splatter, I suggest you get a scrap piece of paper and just practice on that first. Make it a bit thicker. You can also use a fan brush to create a lot of this texture. Alright, that's good for this stage. I'm going to go and dry this now, and I can start putting in some of my sharper edges and broken edges. Now, to create the more of a foliage effect, you've got a number of possible techniques you can use. You can use your brush and just use the side of the brush, but you can also use a sponge, a sea sponge, and that helps you create some interesting textures. And I quite often use a fan brush, which is what I'm going to use today. Here I'm just concentrating on creating interesting shapes. And where I've left light passages, that's where this more yellowish green will go, because that'll allow me to create the brightest greens. I'll still add some in other areas, but I'll also add a lot of darker colours there in a while. My fan brush is a hog hair brush, and I like it because the bristles stick out like this. This one's many years old, so it's quite worn, but it's just the way I like it. I find the ones that are just purely synthetic, they clump together and you don't get these edge variation. Even though it's quite dark underneath, I'll put a little bit of this bright colour, and the two colours will merge optically and help create some variation in some of these darker areas. But I don't keep overworking the same area, or it'll get quite dirty looking. with this duller green. I think it's a bit too green. I'm going to add some more French Ultramarine to it. And more raw umber. Before I do anything else, I'm going to paint in some of these trunks. And you'll see why I like to do that now. Most of these other trunks and branches are quite thin. That mixture is too diluted. Leave little gaps. And I like this branch coming across, connecting the two sides of the painting. And we've got a few smaller branches or trunks down here. Before I put a shape into my painting, or an object into my painting, I look at it and say, do I need that? Because if I don't need it, I don't think it's going to aid the composition, I don't bother putting it in. So I've done that while some of this more detailed foliage is still wet, and now I'll go back in and add some more foliage. And the idea is where the branches and trunks hit wet foliage, they blend together and it gives you a better connection between the foliage and the trunks or the branches. Here I'm going to pick up my sea sponge. I'm just going to show you all the different techniques basically. I move the sponge around so that I'm always picking up different shapes. It does pick up a lot of paint, however, so you have to take that into account. And just lightly dab. Where you don't see light, dab more of this darker colour. And where you see light, then leave the lighter tones there and more light coming through. I step back every now and then and just have a look at the tonal pattern. That's good. Now this is how much paint sea sponge still held. Alright, we'll leave that there for now. Let's work on these rocks. Now I'll mix a slightly warm grey colour, just some raw umber, French ultramarine, and a bit of burnt sienna. Now these rocks, in the photo they look quite light, but they're not white, so what I'm going to do first is just pick up some raw sienna and tint all the rocks. and this will establish the highlights on the rocks. I'll add a little bit of this water. That'll do. Now I'll go and dry this area. So I'm using the tip of the fan brush here, painting the negative shapes, the gaps between the foliage to give the impression of some of this fern. Some quick little dry brush strokes at the water's edge just to help give the impression of foam. And while most of the colours I'm using here are raw umber, burnt sienna and French ultramarine, I vary their consistency to give the rocks some variation and make them look a bit more interesting. Quick dry brush strokes to add texture. And here and there I'll just soften a few of these edges, so these softer edges will round off some of these rocks. And then I lift out a few highlights. If you find your rocks getting a little bit plain, you can get a credit card, and I usually wait until the shines left the surface of the paper, and you can use this to create some interesting textures. I don't always do it. Depends on how the rocks are going, but I thought I'd show you that as a technique. If you go in while the paint is wet, you'll get different types of shapes, darker edges where you scrape into the paper. Just established a few extra highlights there. And then quite often when I do this, I'll pick up a smaller brush, sometimes the rigger, sometimes my size 8 brush, and into some of these shapes just drop in some dark, thicker paint. and it acts like crevices or overlapping rocks. Again, you don't want to overdo this or it looks like you're outlining everything. Now we'll do the water. We've painted the rocks, so these rocks will have reflections in the water. It's almost always better to wait until you've painted the rocks before you paint their reflections. And your reflections will be a little bit duller because the colour you're reflecting will merge with the colour of the water. Alright, so we're nearly there now. I'll just step back a bit. By stepping back from your painting, you can see some of the bigger shapes and some of the tonal variations. And you look, how various colours and shapes are balancing in your work. you'll get some areas where the rock meets the water that are quite a bit darker because none of the light is getting in there. Other areas where you get foam and that, they're a bit lighter. I'm going to extend this rock over here. And the same with this one here. Quite often I'll also mix my colours on the paper and you can get some lovely effects that way. I like to round off the edges of my credit card so that I don't get a very, very sharp scrape when I'm using them. Good. So just little quick dry brush strokes to add a bit of texture. Just hint at grasses and rocks and shapes like that. Alright, that's finished. I'll let that dry and then I'll sign it once it's done. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'd appreciate it if you give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you'll be advised of each new video I produce. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.